What if Shedeur Sanders didn't slide because of talent, but because of power? Not arm strength, not accuracy, not production, but leverage. A quarterback who doesn't need the NFL's money. A prospect tied to Deion Sanders, a player who shifts control before taking a snap, and that quietly made people uncomfortable. When scouts turned on the tape of Shedeur Sanders, the evaluation wasn't simple. It wasn't a highlight reel conversation. It wasn't just vibes or media hype. It was layered, complicated, and at times conflicting. On one hand, the raw traits jump off the screen. The ball placement stands out immediately. He throws with touch down the sideline, layers passes over linebackers, and shows the kind of accuracy in tight windows that translates on Sundays. In multiple games at Colorado Buffaloes, he delivered in high-pressure moments, especially early in the season when the spotlight was at its brightest. The upset over TCU Horned Frogs wasn't just hype, it was poise under chaos. Late drives, calm feet. NFL throws. But then the deeper evaluation begins. The sack numbers are impossible to ignore. Week after week, Sanders absorbed heavy hits. Some of that was clearly protection breakdowns. Colorado's offensive line struggled against elite pass rushers, and there were snaps where pressure arrived instantly. Yet NFL scouts are trained to separate line failure from quarterback responsibility, and that's where the debate intensifies. Does he hold the ball too long? On tape, there are plays where the first read isn't there, and instead of throwing it away, he extends, resets, drifts, sometimes creating bigger problems. His internal clock becomes a point of discussion. In college, he could survive it. In the NFL, defenders close faster, windows shrink quicker, and hits add up. Durability becomes part of the projection. Then there's pocket movement. He's not a pure runner, but he's mobile enough. The question isn't whether he can move, it's whether he moves proactively or reactively. Elite NFL quarterbacks feel pressure before it arrives. With Sanders, scouts saw flashes of that awareness, but not consistency. Still, the upside is real. His toughness is undeniable. He stood in against pressure and delivered strikes knowing contact was coming. Teammates rallied around him. Coaches trusted him to throw in critical moments. Those are traits evaluators value. So the tape tells two stories at once. One story says, accurate, fearless, franchise-caliber arm talent with leadership presence. The other says, takes too many hits, invites pressure, and hasn't proven he can consistently speed up his processing against top-tier defenses. And that tension between what he shows and what he must fix is exactly why his evaluation became one of the most debated in recent memory. The season didn't just unfold, it swung. When Shedeur Sanders and the Colorado Buffaloes opened the year with statement wins, the entire country locked in. The upset over TCU Horned Frogs ignited a media firestorm. Rankings surged, television ratings exploded. Every pregame show led with Colorado. The program wasn't just competitive, it was cultural. And at the center of it all was Shedeur. He wasn't playing in quiet anonymity. He was operating inside a traveling spotlight powered by Deion Sanders. Every throw, every celebration, every press conference became national content. For a few weeks, the narrative felt unstoppable. Future first-round pick, franchise quarterback, face of a new era. Then reality hit. Defenses adjusted. Pass rushers overwhelmed Colorado's offensive line. The physical toll on Shedeur mounted. Losses stacked. The protection issues that were manageable early became glaring under better competition. Games that once looked like statement victories turned into weekly survival tests. And in the NFL draft world, momentum matters. The conversation shifted from is he QB1 to how much is system, how much is hype? Analysts who once praised his poise began questioning his pocket discipline. The national excitement cooled. What had been a meteoric rise started to look like a market correction. Fair or not, evaluators are influenced by trajectory. Rising prospects generate comfort. Sliding teams create doubt. When Colorado's record dipped, it wasn't just a team storyline, it reframed Shedeur's projection. Instead of evaluating isolated throws, scouts began asking harder contextual questions. Was he elevating the roster or simply surviving it? Did early success inflate expectations? Would the NFL version of those late-season pressures expose flaws faster? The truth is, quarterback narratives are fragile. They are built on moments and they are dismantled by stretches. By the end of the season, the conversation around Shedeur wasn't about highlights anymore. It was about sustainability, durability, adaptability. whether the early season version was the true indicator or the losing stretch revealed deeper concerns. And once doubt enters a quarterback evaluation, it doesn't leave quietly. Because from that point forward, teams weren't just studying his arm. They were studying the volatility surrounding him. Drafting Shedeur Sanders doesn't just mean drafting a quarterback. It means drafting a gravitational force. Because wherever Shedeur goes, the presence of Deion Sanders follows, not physically on the sideline, but in narrative weight, media volume, and public scrutiny. And for NFL franchises, that reality isn't emotional, it's strategic. Front offices value control, coaches value stability, general managers value quiet development. The NFL is built on hierarchy, ownership, GM, head coach, quarterback. That structure functions best when influence flows in predictable directions. With Shedeur, the perception, fair or not, is different. Deion isn't a typical football parent. He's one of the most recognizable figures in the sport, a Hall of Fame personality, a media magnet, a coach who transformed Colorado Buffaloes into a national spectacle overnight. His voice carries weight. His comments trend instantly. His approval or criticism can dominate a news cycle. So the question quietly forming in some executive rooms isn't about talent. It's about ecosystem. If Shedeur struggles early, does the noise amplify? If he's benched, does it become a national debate? If coaching decisions impact him, does outside commentary create pressure? None of this is confirmed internal fear, but perception matters in risk evaluation. NFL teams aren't just drafting skill sets, they're drafting long-term organizational dynamics. There's also the branding layer. Shedeur already operates with a high-profile presence. Cameras follow him, interviews circulate widely. Add Deion's visibility to that equation and you create a spotlight that can either energize a franchise or intensify every mistake. For some teams, that spotlight is a marketing dream. For others, it's a volatility factor. And volatility in draft rooms often lowers certainty grades. It doesn't mean teams doubt his ability, it means they must calculate ripple effects beyond the field, because once a quarterback is selected, he becomes the face of the franchise. Every win, every loss, every quote gets magnified. With Shedeur, the amplification level starts higher than most rookies. And that leads to a subtle but powerful evaluation question. Are you drafting a quarterback? Or are you drafting an entire narrative machine? For bold organizations, that's opportunity. For cautious ones, that's complication. And in the NFL draft, complication can quietly move a player down boards, even when the talent says he belongs near the top. Before ever stepping into an NFL facility, Shedeur Sanders was already operating from a position most rookie quarterbacks never experience. Financial independence. Thanks to the modern nil era, Shedeur didn't enter the draft as a prospect hopping for his first major payday. During his time with the Colorado Buffaloes, he reportedly built one of the more valuable personal brands in college football, fueled by endorsement deals, national visibility, and the marketing engine surrounding the Sanders name. And while exact figures vary publicly, the broader point isn't the number. It's the leverage. For decades, the NFL draft system has operated with an unspoken advantage. Most incoming players need the league more than the league needs them. Rookie contracts are slotted. The wage scale limits negotiation. Teams control players for up to 5 years. Financial security, for most, depends entirely on sticking within that structure. But what happens when a quarterback doesn't feel financial pressure the same way? It subtly shifts psychology. Shedeur doesn't enter the league desperate for stability. He enters it as an already established brand. That independence can be empowering, but from a front office perspective, it introduces unfamiliar variables. When a player has strong outside income streams and media traction, his bargaining posture can feel different, even if he never exercises it. And perception matters. Historically, quarterbacks who demonstrated leverage before entering the league, like Eli Manning or John Elway, forced teams to navigate uncomfortable draft day dynamics. Those were extreme cases, but they shaped executive memory. NFL front offices are risk managers by design. They study precedent. Shedeur never publicly threatened to avoid teams. There's no confirmed report of draft maneuvering, But evaluators don't only assess actions, they assess possibilities. Would he be content sitting behind a veteran for 2 years? Would his brand outgrow the market he's drafted into? Would endorsement obligations compete with team-first culture? Again, none of these are accusations, they're projection questions. There's also the cultural shift at play. The nil era has empowered college athletes in ways the NFL hasn't fully adjusted to yet. Teams are accustomed to molding rookies into the system. But players entering with established platforms operate differently. They understand audience, optics, and narrative control. For some organizations, that's a marketing goldmine. For others, it's less predictable. Because control, contract control, messaging control, development control has always been one of the NFL's hidden currencies. And when a quarterback arrives already empowered, that traditional balance subtly changes. It doesn't mean teams view him as difficult. It means they view him as different. And in draft rooms, different can either be visionary or uncomfortable. The irony is that nil success signals discipline, marketability, and leadership, all positive traits. But it also signals autonomy, and autonomy in a league built on structure forces franchises to ask a deeper question. Are we prepared for a quarterback who doesn't need us in the traditional sense? For some teams, that answer is yes. For others, hesitation alone can be enough to adjust a draft board. And sometimes, in the NFL, even slight hesitation changes everything. Confidence is one of the most praised traits in a quarterback. Until it is. With Shedeur Sanders, that line became razor thin. Supporters see composure, swagger, command, the kind of self-belief you have to possess to survive the NFL spotlight. Critics see something more volatile, a personality that could clash if early adversity hits. And in draft evaluations, perception often weighs as much as production. Quarterbacks are expected to lead grown men, control locker rooms, and carry franchises worth billions. That requires presence. Teammates at Colorado Buffaloes consistently spoke about Shedeur's toughness and poise. He absorbed hits, stood in collapsing pockets, and rarely appeared rattled publicly. Those are leadership indicators scouts value highly. But leadership in college and leadership in the NFL are different ecosystems. In the NFL, you're no longer the coach's son. You're no longer the most famous name in the building by default. Veterans have contracts, accolades, and egos. Establishing authority requires balance, confidence without alienation. That's where comparisons started surfacing. Some analysts drew parallels to Baker Mayfield, a player whose confidence energized teams early but at times rubbed people the wrong way. Others invoked the cautionary tale of Johnny Manziel, where swagger overshadowed structure. On the other end of the spectrum, supporters referenced players like Patrick Mahomes, whose belief in his own abilities fuels fearless playmaking. The key difference: results shape perception. When confident quarterbacks win, their attitude becomes moxie. When they lose, it becomes immaturity. That duality sits at the center of Shedeur's evaluation. In interviews, he's direct. He speaks with certainty. He carries himself like a franchise quarterback before officially becoming one. For some front offices, that's exactly what you want: a player who believes he belongs from day one. For others, the question becomes subtler. How does he respond when he's not the star? How does he react to public criticism at the professional level? Can confidence transition into collaborative leadership? It's not about silencing personality. The modern NFL embraces individuality more than ever, but quarterback remains the most scrutinized position in American sports. Every gesture is dissected. Every post-game quote becomes content. Every sideline expression becomes a talking point. And with Shedeur, the scrutiny begins amplified. There's also the prime effect. Being the son of Deion Sanders means he's grown up around elite expectations. That environment can create maturity beyond years, or it can create assumptions from outsiders that he's been insulated. Again, no confirmed internal red flags exist publicly, no documented locker room issues, no reported interview disasters, but the NFL draft is about projection, not resume alone. Teams aren't just drafting the player they see today. They're drafting the personality under pressure. Confidence, when paired with accountability, becomes leadership. Confidence without adaptation becomes friction. The line between those outcomes is thin and often determined only after live NFL reps. For some evaluators, Shedeur's self-assurance signals readiness. For others, it introduces uncertainty. And in draft rooms, uncertainty, even slight, can tilt decisions. Because at quarterback, teams aren't just buying talent. They're investing in temperament. And temperament is harder to measure than arm strength. If there was one statistic that kept resurfacing in conversations about Shedeur Sanders, it wasn't touchdowns. It was sacks. Quarterbacks can survive interceptions. They can recover from bad games, but consistent sacks, especially high-volume sacks, trigger deeper concern inside NFL draft rooms because sacks aren't just lost yardage, they're absorbed hits, they're accumulated punishment, and over time they become durability questions. At Colorado Buffaloes, Shedeur took a significant number of hits throughout the season. Some games felt like survival drills. The offensive line struggled against elite pass rushers. There were snaps where pressure arrived instantly, collapsing the pocket before routes even developed. Supporters point to that immediately. They argue the protection failures inflated the sack totals. They highlight plays where defenders came untouched. They emphasize his toughness, standing in, delivering throws while bracing for contact. In that view, the sack numbers reflect team weakness, not quarterback flaw. But NFL scouts don't stop at surface explanations. They slow the tape down. And that's where the evaluation becomes more complicated. On film, there are moments where the first read isn't available. Instead of throwing the ball away or checking down quickly, Shedeur sometimes drifts. He extends, he looks for the bigger play. That patience can create explosive gains, but it can also extend plays just long enough for defensive linemen to close in. In the NFL, that half-second matters. Elite quarterbacks develop what scouts call an internal clock. It's the instinctive awareness of when a play is dead, when to escape, when to reset, when to live for the next down. For Shedeur, evaluators saw flashes of that awareness but not consistent mastery. The concern isn't about bravery. No one questions his willingness to take hits. The concern is sustainability. NFL pass rushers are faster, stronger, and more disciplined than most college defenders. Windows shrink. Edge rushers bend tighter. Defensive coordinators disguise pressure more effectively. If a quarterback holds the ball too long at the professional level, punishment escalates quickly. There's also the mechanical layer. Sometimes sacks aren't about holding the ball, they're about subtle pocket movement. Elite quarterbacks slide inches left or right to buy space. They feel pressure without seeing it. With Shedeur, scouts debated whether his movement was reactive instead of anticipatory. That distinction becomes critical on Sundays. Still, context matters. Colorado's roster transition under Deion Sanders meant constant adjustments. New systems, new personnel, that instability affects protection chemistry. Quarterbacks in those environments often carry more burden than ideal. But NFL teams evaluate projection, not sympathy. They ask, will this improve with better protection? Or is this a habit that must be coached out? Can he speed up processing against disguised coverages? Will he protect himself when structure breaks down? The sack conversation ultimately isn't about blame. It's about risk management. Quarterbacks who absorb excessive hits early in their careers often face shortened primes. Availability becomes a silent factor in draft positioning. A general manager choosing between two similarly graded prospects may lean toward the one with fewer durability flags. And that's where the sack totals linger. Not as an indictment of talent, not as proof of limitation, but as a projection variable. Because in the NFL, the best ability is availability. And when a quarterback's tape shows repeated exposure to heavy contact, front offices don't ignore it. They calculate it. And sometimes, that calculation subtly reshapes an entire draft board. For fans, the NFL draft is excitement, hope, debate, potential. For general managers, it's employment. Every time a GM turns in a draft card, he isn't just selecting a player, he's attaching his career to that decision. And when it comes to drafting a quarterback like Shedeur Sanders, the stakes multiply instantly. Quarterback is different. Miss on a linebacker and you adjust next year, miss on a wide receiver and it stings, miss on a quarterback in the first round, that can reset an entire front office. Coaches get fired, GMs lose contracts, ownership cleans house. So when executives evaluated Shedeur, they weren't just asking, can he play? They were asking, can he protect my job? That sounds harsh, but it's reality. NFL decision-makers operate under immense pressure. Ownership expects progress. Fan bases demand answers. Media cycles amplify every misstep, and in high-profile cases, scrutiny doubles. Drafting Shedeur doesn't happen quietly. He arrives with visibility, expectations, and an existing national spotlight, partly because of his own brand and partly because of his connection to Deion Sanders. That spotlight can be energizing if things go well. But if struggles begin early, the narrative machine accelerates fast. Imagine this scenario. A GM drafts Shedeur in the top 10. He starts midway through his rookie season. He takes hits, the team loses. National analysts debate whether the pick was driven by hype. That storyline doesn't stay contained within the building. It becomes talk radio, it becomes trending clips, it becomes pressure from ownership asking, are we sure this was the right move? Now flip the scenario. Another quarterback, less famous, lower profile, struggles in the same way. The media coverage is quieter. The development timeline feels less urgent. The organization buys patience. That difference matters. Fair or unfair, perception influences job security. There's also the safe pick psychology that exists in every draft room. When two prospects carry similar grades, executives often lean toward the one perceived as lower volatility, not necessarily lower upside, but lower narrative risk. Shedeur represents high upside, but he also represents amplified scrutiny. And scrutiny shortens timelines. General managers know that public opinion can shape ownership patience. If a pick becomes polarizing, it reduces margin for error. Every interception becomes magnified. Every missed read becomes content, every post-game comment becomes dissected. That doesn't mean teams believed Shedeur would fail. It means they had to weigh the consequences if he did. There's also historical memory inside front offices. Executives study past quarterback swings, both hits and misses. They remember aggressive moves that paid off. They remember bold picks that didn't. The league is full of former GMs who bet their careers on a quarterback projection and lost. So the question becomes strategic. Do you take the prospect who might change everything but carries noise? Or do you take the prospect who fits cleanly into your system and buys you development time? In many cases, especially for front offices without long-term security, risk tolerance shrinks. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Draft boards are shaped not just by talent grades, but by human psychology. A GM with a new contract might swing bigger. A GM entering the final year of his deal might prioritize stability. An ownership group craving headlines might embrace star power. Another ownership group might prefer quiet growth. All of that context surrounds a quarterback evaluation. So when Shedeur's name hovered on draft boards, the debate wasn't only about mechanics, sacks, or leadership traits. It was about volatility versus security. Because if he succeeds, the GM looks visionary. If he struggles, the GM becomes the cautionary tale. And in a league where careers can hinge on one quarterback decision, that calculation is impossible to ignore. At the highest level of the NFL, talent evaluation is never purely about ability. It's about risk. And risk, more than anything else, determines how bold a franchise is willing to be. Here's the part of this entire conversation that rarely gets discussed. What if Shedeur Sanders wins? Not flashes, not viral throws, not preseason hype. Wins. Because if he steps into the NFL and produces early, if he commands a huddle, limits turnovers, survives pressure, and stacks victories, the entire narrative flips overnight. And when narratives flip in the NFL, they don't quietly adjust. They rewrite history. Suddenly, the confidence that once felt polarizing becomes alpha leadership. The brand presence becomes marketability. The spotlight becomes star power. The independence becomes maturity beyond his years. We've seen this transformation before. Quarterbacks who were labeled too flashy become celebrated as fearless once results follow. Those described as overconfident become praised for unshakable belief. The league doesn't resist personality, it resists personality without production. If Shedeur produces, the archetype conversation changes. For decades, the NFL quarterback prototype centered around a specific mold: reserved, coach-speak polished, system-first personality. Over time, that mold has evolved. Players are more expressive, more visible, more brand-aware. The league has adjusted, but cautiously. Shedeur represents a further evolution. He entered college football already understanding optics, already understanding audience, already comfortable in front of cameras. Under Deion Sanders, he operated in an environment where attention wasn't a distraction, it was part of the atmosphere. If he wins in the NFL, that environment becomes validation. It would signal that a quarterback can carry visibility, personality, and autonomy without sacrificing performance. It would encourage front offices to reevaluate how they define safe leadership traits. It would normalize the idea that branding and football discipline can coexist at the highest level. More importantly, it would challenge the quiet bias that comfort equals competence. Because sometimes teams draft what feels stable rather than what might be transformational. If Shedeur thrives, executives who passed on him will face uncomfortable questions, not because they made reckless decisions, but because they prioritized caution. And in hindsight, caution can look like hesitation. Winning changes tone. Analysts who once questioned his sack numbers would credit his toughness. Critics who debated his internal clock would praise his composure. Discussions about volatility would morph into admiration for fearlessness. That's how quickly perception shifts in this league. And beyond individual validation, his success would reinforce a broader trend: the empowered quarterback era. Players entering the NFL with financial backing, media platforms, and established identities aren't going away. The nil era ensures that future prospects will arrive similarly equipped. If Shedeur proves that such players can lead franchises successfully, the archetype permanently expands. Front offices would begin asking different questions. Instead of "can we control the environment?" they might ask, "can we build around it?" Instead of "is this too loud?" they might ask, "is this the new normal?" The irony is that the traits debated pre-draft could become the very advantages that separate him: comfort in big moments, immunity to external noise, familiarity with scrutiny. Those aren't liabilities, they're survival skills in a 24/7 media league. But all of this hinges on one thing: production. Because the NFL forgives almost everything except losing. If Shedeur wins, the narrative doesn't just soften. It swings. And in 3 years, the question may not be why he slid, but why anyone doubted that the archetype itself was evolving. Because sometimes the league doesn't reject talent. It simply takes time to adjust to what the future looks like. And if he succeeds, that future might look a lot like him. When everything is stripped away, the headlines, the debates, the projections, the evaluation of Shedeur Sanders was never simple. It wasn't just about arm talent. It wasn't just about sack numbers. It wasn't just about confidence, branding, or visibility. It was about risk layered on top of talent. On film, you see a quarterback capable of making NFL throws, tight window accuracy, poise in chaos. The toughness to stand in against pressure, the kind of composure that suggests he believes he belongs on Sundays. Those traits are real, they're not manufactured by hype. But the concerns were real too. The hits absorbed behind a struggling offensive line at the Colorado Buffaloes, the internal clock that sometimes ran half a beat late, the volatility that comes with drafting a player who enters the league already amplified, partly by his own presence, partly by the gravitational pull of Deion Sanders. None of those factors alone define a draft slide. Together they create calculation. And NFL front offices calculate for a living. They calculate probability. They calculate durability. They calculate locker room dynamics. They calculate ownership patience. They calculate how much time they'll be given if development isn't immediate. That's the part fans rarely see. Draft decisions are not just about ceiling. They're about survivability for the player and for the decision makers tied to him. A general manager isn't only asking, can this quarterback be great? He's asking, if he isn't immediately great, can I withstand the fallout? With Shedeur, the equation included variables that don't appear in box scores: brand independence, media intensity, narrative volume, archetype shift, empowerment in the nil era, the possibility that he represents a version of the modern quarterback some franchises are still adjusting to. That doesn't mean teams feared him. It means they weighed him. And weighing risk is not the same as doubting talent. Sometimes a player slides because evaluators see fatal flaws. Sometimes a player slides because the evaluation feels uncomfortable. And sometimes it's simply because another quarterback felt marginally safer. History has a way of exposing which category it was. If Shedeur develops into a franchise cornerstone, the narrative will pivot quickly. The same traits debated pre-draft will be reframed as strengths. Confidence will be leadership. Visibility will be market value. Independence will be maturity. And teams that passed will be asked what they missed. If he struggles, the concerns will look predictive. The sack totals will resurface. The questions about pocket timing will echo. The volatility will be labeled foresight rather than hesitation. That's the unforgiving nature of quarterback evaluation. Outcomes rewrite logic. But here's the most important point. His draft position does not define his ceiling. Plenty of quarterbacks have entered the league without unanimous belief. Development is rarely linear. Situation matters, coaching matters, protection matters, patience matters. What makes this story compelling isn't outrage or conspiracy. It's complexity. Shedeur's journey sits at the intersection of talent and transformation, a league adapting to empowered athletes, a generation entering with leverage, and franchises deciding how much change they're comfortable embracing. So the real question isn't whether he should have gone higher. The real question is whether the league evaluated him purely on football or partially on comfort. And in a few years, when the results are undeniable one way or the other, we won't just be judging his play. We'll be judging the decisions made around him. Because in the NFL, quarterbacks don't just reveal who they are. They reveal who is bold enough to believe.